Let us begin by asking a simple question. How many objects do you see? Do you see one object, or do you see 5? How about when viewed from a different perspective? Do you still see 5 objects, or do you see 1? How about when images appear confusing or ambiguous? Do you see a tree, or do you see an ape and a lion? These are the types of questions we probably just take for granted. However, research in the field of object identification has spent a great deal of time contemplating. My name is Christopher Stevens, and today we will be exploring a slice of that world as we delve into the world of visual cognition. Today we will explore the research on how human perception organizes visual information into a three-dimensional simulation. It is this simulation that allows our brain to identify objects from any viewpoint. To achieve this, we will explore research from 1. Gestalt psychology, 2. Cognitive development in children, and 3. Cognitive neuroscience. Let us begin by exploring the Gestalt principles. Gestalt psychology has endeavored over the past 100 years to understand how visual phenomena is interpreted by the brain. As a result, Gestalt psychology has an enormous impact on visual cognition. Research into many of the visual perception problems have been rooted in Gestalt psychology, which many of these principles have been validated by numerous experiments with adults. According to Wegmans et al., Gestalt psychology has the following principles: Bayesian approach to grouping principles, verticality of simplicity, and the nature of visual regularity. Wegmans concludes that each principle has led to fruitful research, but none has solved the conundrum of Gestalt in its entirety. Gestalt principle of proximity states that our brains tend to interpret visual stimuli by proximity. As seen in this picture, the proximal relationships of squares causes you to interpret it as a nighttime cityscape rather than just black and white rectangles. The Gestalt principle of simplicity states that the human brain reduces images to their simplest possible form. As seen in this picture, you interpret it as 3 circles with an occluding triangle, even though no such triangle is present. The Gestalt principle of regularity states that objects are formed from visual regularities that occur within the scene, and that the brain seeks to promote visual regularity throughout the scene. As shown in this picture, you interpret it as a silhouette of a woman, since the symmetrical regularity promotes facial recognition. Now that we have a better understanding on Gestalt as related to object identification, let us turn our attention to cognitive development. The work of Gestalt psychologists has spawned many debates within the realm of cognitive science. Primarily, as with Wegmans et al. Conclusions, many researchers have questioned exactly how perception arises in humans, and whether the Gestalt principles are hardwired at birth, or do they manifest themselves through experience as a result of more basic cognitive functions. According to Spelke's article, Principles of Object Perception, children obey different principles of visual perception. In her paper, Spelke states that 1. Gestalt principles of proximity and simplicity fail in infants and young children. Instead, infants and children tend to associate motion with object identity rather than its proximal relationships to other stimuli. 2. Infants detect object by surface arrangement and motions. That is, infants detect objects that move coherently as a single unit. 3. Perception is amodal. Infants, when presented with objects that they can manipulate but not see, apprehend those objects in the same manner as if they were seen. And 4. Perceptions yield representations of unseen portions of objects. Again, infants were found to perceive partially hidden objects as uniform if the object moved together behind an occluding shape. The last area, and the most modern, is neuroscience. Neuroscience has taken a fundamentally different approach to cognitive science. This approach attempts to model cognition based on how the human brain has divided its processing roles. Specifically, neuroscience is focused on the three primary areas of the brain as related to vision: the retina, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and the visual cortex. According to Palmieri and Gauthier's paper, Visual Object Understanding, any system capable of object identification similar to humans must be able to 1. Take as input a set of two-dimensional arrays similar to the output of the human retina. 2. Transform that output into a three-dimensional representation similar to how the lateral geniculate nucleus operates. And 3. Store or calculate viewpoints of an object from 2 such that an object can be identified from any viewing perspective. Palmieri and Gauthier's paper concludes by conceding that such systems have inherent problems related towards viewpoint storage. Storing object representations in a viewpoint-dependent or independent manner both have challenges to overcome. In addition, Palmieri also concedes that neuroscience has yet to include research from object perception disciplines. In conclusion, we have explored the research on how human perception organizes visual information into a three-dimensional simulation. It is this simulation that allows our brain to identify objects from any viewpoint. To recap, you had an opportunity to explore object identification. Specifically, we have examined research from Gestalt psychology, cognitive development, and cognitive neuroscience. My conclusion is that human object identification operates at a higher cognitive level than both visual and motor systems. As Palmieri states in his conclusion, that synthesis with object perception must be done, and Spelke's research on children has indicated that perception is identical with regard to tactile input and visual input. This coupling of motor functions and visual functions explains how the human brain is capable of rotating or transforming visual imagery. It does so by borrowing the power of motor functions which can operate spatially to produce differing viewpoints and thus allows higher level cognitive functions to identify objects from any perspective. And finally, I'd like to leave you with one last thought. How is it that you can manage to insert your car key into its ignition without viewing the key or seeing the ignition keyhole?